During World War II, U-boat warfare was the major component of the Battle of the Atlantic, which began in 1939 and ended with Germany's surrender in 1945. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later wrote, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." Cross-Atlantic trade in war supplies and food was extensive and critical for Britain's survival. The continuous action surrounding Allied shipping became known as the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boats operated also off the southern African coasts and even as far east as the Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean. By the end of the war, almost 3,000 Allied ships, 175 warships and 2,825 merchant ships had been sunk by U-boat torpedoes. In total 1131 U-boats entered service before the German surrender, of which 863 have executed war patrols, and 785 were lost. The U-boat's main weapon was the torpedo and the deck gun while surfaced. But there were special U-boats which had a totally different task. Their job was not to attack ships, but to lay minefields. It is a little-known fact, but German U-boats planted over 100 minefields during the war. 96 ships of 403,355 gross register tonnage were hit by mines laid by German U-boats until 1945. Operations started in the first weeks of the war. In support of Hitler's planned attack on France in November 1939, Admiral Erich Raeder and the German Navy High Command had ordered German surface ships, aircraft, and submarines to mine British seaports. The primary aim of the mining campaign was to shut off the flow of British troops and supplies to the continent. A secondary aim was to disrupt or shut down British merchant shipping, sowing terror and panic. Restricted by a shortage of magnetic mines, which had not been mass-produced in peacetime, the campaign got off to a halting start. Mine-layer submarines seemed very seductive to many admiralties even before World War I. During the interwar, the German Navy was forbidden by the Versailles Treaty to have any submarines. But in the first years of the war, the German Navy developed a special, long-range mine-layer submarine, the Type 10 U-boat. The Type 10 was originally designed specifically to accommodate the newly developed shack mine moored mine. The initial specification asked to provide dry storage for these mines, which needed their detonators to be individually adjusted before launch by the crew. The final submarine was projected to have a 2,500 tons displacement, surfaced. As work progressed, it was envisioned a further variant, the Type 10A, which was to be fitted with extra mine shafts in the saddle tanks, but they were never ordered as war priority changed. Type 10B U-boats were experimental submarines developed before the war, were larger and more powerful than other U-boats to enable long-distance operations, and remaining submerged for extended periods of time thanks to a large battery capacity. Thus, they were in theory able to mine the Canadian and U.S. East Coast among others. They were powered by diesel-electric engines and had a top speed of around 16 knots when surfaced and 9 knots when submerged. The crew complement was around 50 men. However, as priorities shifted, they were soon swapped from roles, as supply vessels for German submarines operating in the Atlantic Ocean with fuel, torpedoes, and other essential supplies, and more commonly to transport valuable assets to the distant ports of Japan. Altogether 8 Type 10B boats were produced, which replaced the initial mine chamber of the previous Type 10A with 6 vertical wet storage shafts in the forward section of the hull. They were all built in Kiel, in 3 batches from 1941 to 1944. 6 of the 8 boats built were sunk during the war, but 2 survived World War II. One survivor was the famous U-234, which surrendered to U.S. Navy ships on May 14, 1945 while en route for Japan. The cargo to be carried was determined towards the end of 1944, at which time the submarine's officers were informed that they were to make a special voyage to Japan. When loading was completed, the submarine's officers estimated that they were carrying 240 tons of cargo plus sufficient diesel fuel and provisions for a 9-month voyage. The cargo included technical drawings, examples of the newest electric torpedoes, 1 Krated Me-262 jet aircraft, a Henschel HS-293 glide bomb and 550 kilograms of uranium oxide. After the capture of the U-boat, this amount of uranium disappeared. It was most likely transferred to the Manhattan Project's Oak Ridge diffusion plant. The uranium oxide would have yielded approximately 3.5 kg of U-235 after processing, around 20% of what would have been required to arm a contemporary fission weapon. When the cargo was loaded, U-234 carried out additional trials near Kiel, then returned to the northern German city where her passengers came aboard. U-234 was carrying 12 passengers, including a German general, 4 German naval officers, civilian engineers and scientists, and 2 Japanese naval officers. The German personnel included General Ulrich Kessler of the Luftwaffe, who was to take over Luftwaffe liaison duties in Tokyo, Heinz Schlick, a specialist in radar, infrared, and countermeasures and director of the naval test fields in Kiel, and August Brinchwald, who was in charge of Mi-262 production at Messerschmitt. The Japanese passengers were Lieutenant Commander Hideo Tomonaga of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a naval architect and submarine designer who had come to Germany in 1943, and Lieutenant Commander Shoji Genzo, an aircraft specialist and former naval attaché. U-234 departed Germany for Japan on April 15, 1945, running submerged at snorkel depth for the first 16 days, and surfacing after that only because her commander, Captain Johann Heinrich Feller, considered he was safe from attack on the surface in the prevailing severe storm. From then on, she spent 2 hours running on the surface by night, and the remainder of the time submerged. The voyage proceeded without incident. The first sign that world affairs were overtaking the voyage was when the Navy HQ's transmitter stopped transmitting. Feller did not know it, but Germany's naval HQ had fallen into Allied hands. Then, on May 4, U-234 received a fragment of a broadcast from British and American radio stations announcing that Admiral Karl Donitz had become Germany's head of state following the death of Adolf Hitler. U-234 surfaced on May 10 for better radio reception and received Donitz's last order to the submarine force, ordering all U-boats to surface, hoist white flags and surrender to Allied forces. Feller suspected a trick and managed to contact another U-boat, whose captain convinced him that the message was authentic. At this point, the U-boat was almost equidistant from British, Canadian, and U.S. ports. Feller decided not to continue his journey, and instead headed for the east coast of the United States. He consequently decided that he would surrender to U.S. forces, but radioed on May 12 that he intended to sail to Halifax, Nova Scotia, to surrender to ensure Canadian units would not reach him first. U-234 then set course for Newport News, Virginia. During the passage, Feller disposed of his radar detector, the new radio communication system, and all Enigma machine-related documents and other classified papers. On learning that the U-boat was to surrender, the 2 Japanese passengers committed suicide by taking an overdose of luminol, a barbiturate sedative and anti-epileptic drug. They were buried at sea. The other survivor was U-219, which reached present-day Jakarta in December 1944 with a cargo including dismantled V-2 rockets for Japan. Following Germany's surrender, U-219 was seized and used by the Japanese Navy. She was never assigned a Japanese crew and was captured by the British after Japan's surrender, being sunk in February 1946 by the Royal Navy along with several other captured U-boats. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss my future work, please make sure you are subscribed to my channel and press the bell notification button. Thank you, and see you in the next video.